homage to the Sangha. I thought I'd talk a little bit this afternoon about what Buddhism, what Zen is not, because there are a lot of misunderstandings about Zen. And first of all, what you have to remember is that Zen is one of many subdivisions of Buddhism. And there are two, at the moment in time, two major subdivisions. There's the Theravadan school, or the Orthodox school, of which Venerable Sudaso is a member. And then there is the Mahayana school, which is one that comprehends Zen as well as some other things. Now, this is not something new, because what the Buddha had to teach was for each and every one of us how to find our way through life, how to learn to see things as they truly are, as opposed to how we like them to be or how we thought they would be, or how other people tell us they are. It makes sense that when somebody follows that teaching and internalizes it, and then starts to teach him or herself, that it comes out in a very personal way for every person individually, slightly differently. And that started to happen already with the Buddha's disciples. And so then they have their students and they have their students, and pretty soon things look quite different from here to there. And so at one point, I think this is, you maybe correct me, but after about 500 years or something, there was the period of the many schools. And so then there was, well, there are too many schools, so they had a big meeting and they sort of consolidated a few of them. But this process sort of happens over time. And then as Buddhism travels from one culture to another, it adapts to the culture because it is so personal. So you have Tibetan Buddhism, which looks very different from Chinese Buddhism and Japanese Buddhism and Korean and Vietnamese and all these other. And now we have American Buddhism. If it wants to really be Buddhism, it has to have two things: the practice of meditation in some form or other, and the practice of morality. And that is very important. Within Buddhist practice, that is understood. Morality being, do as little harm as possible, do as much good as possible, and do good for others, and or purify your heart, however you want to phrase that last one. Those are tacitly understood in Buddhist culture. So when Bodhidharma, who's called the father of Zen, went to China, Zen didn't exist until that moment. That was in the year, around about the year 300, so it's a long time ago. And Bodhidharma lived in India. He was an Indian Buddhist monk. And his teacher was actually a woman. And he wanted to travel, and she said, no. Not until I'm dead, you're not traveling. So he waited, and he studied with her, and when she died, he was in his 60s. And then he decided he wanted to go to China. And that took him 3 years by boat. They sort of went up the coast in little spurts. And when he arrived in China, Buddhism had already been there for several hundred years. And what they were practicing mostly was a form of very devotional Buddhism. A lot of chanting, a lot of offerings, a lot of beautiful pictures, and people who had money, they would make offerings and they would build beautiful temples, pretty much like what they did in the Middle Ages in Europe. And there was this local emperor, and he heard this teacher, this Buddhist teacher from India was coming, and India was the heart of Buddhism. So he invited Bodhidharma over and said, look at this, what I've done. I've built this beautiful temple and made so many donations, and what's going to be my reward? What are the blessings for that? And he was sincere in that. You have to, not look down on that. But he did want a little appreciation and some job satisfaction. And Bodhidharma, for whatever reason, I like to think he was a foreigner. There might be a bit of a translation problem. Maybe he was tired. But he snapped at the emperor and said, if that's how you look at it, there's no merit at all. If you do it for gain, forget it. So the emperor was deeply hurt and upset, and Bodhidharma had to flee. He fled to a local monastery and sat down and realized, that wasn't very skillful. And it wasn't, because he, instead of encouraging somebody who was doing a practice and maybe still had some self-interest in it, instead of encouraging him, he just kind of upset him. And so he realized he needed to do some more meditation himself, and famously it is said he then sat and looked at a wall for 9 more years. So since then he has the reputation of being very stern and very abrupt and very directly to the point, but we have very little actual footage, so we don't really know how that all came about. He only had 2 disciples, and one of them left. So he probably was difficult. It probably was difficult to be with. But at the same time, some of his teachings have kept alive till today, and to me they speak very directly. They're very heart to heart and immediate. From that moment on, that particular way of practice, very directly, very personally, no frills, became the Zen practice in China, Chan, as it's called. And people being people, and everybody giving their own expression to it. What happens is, whenever there's a little form to practice, whatever that form is, if people like it, or if it works in a certain situation, then we have the idea of, this works for me, so it's working for you. In American vernacular, we say, what you need to do is this, because it worked for me, and now you need it. And the same happens in religious practice. And so various things that are actual side issues of the Zen practice, expressions of it, but not necessarily the essence, they become a thing in themselves. So in China, martial arts became a big development as a side issue of the practice of disciplining yourself, training your mind, training your body, paying great attention to detail, putting a lot of effort in it. And then if you put that into martial arts, you'll get very good at it. If you put it into sword fighting, you get very good at it. You put it into calligraphy, you get beautiful calligraphy. Those things are beautiful in themselves and they're good practice, but they're not the spiritual practice of Zen, right? And then that connection gets lost a little bit. When I lived in England, in a monastery there was a town not too far away where there was a martial arts school. And one day they decided to put all the boys in a bus and come and visit the monks, and they came and we showed them all around, and we had this little shrine of Bodhidharma, and they were really excited because Bodhidharma is a patron of the martial arts. And there he was. So I was doing the tour, and I said, well, let's just all sit down and do some meditation. And we all sat down. I gave them a little meditation instruction. And at the end of it, they said, this is very much like what we do every time we have a practice session. Our teacher makes us all sit down. We don't know why. We don't know what we're doing. We're mostly just thinking about our moves. And I said, well, didn't you ask the teacher what you're doing? And they said, yeah. And he said, well, I don't know either, but my teacher had us do that. And so, who knows how many generations they actually lost the meditation part of it. They were still sitting there, but they were just waiting for it to be over. That's an interesting thing to happen. And every now and then, by accident, somebody will use that time and meditate and have an insight, because it also happens backwards. In Japan, where people have a great sense of aesthetics, the practice of Zen blossomed out into calligraphy, ikebana or flower arrangement, ceremonial to the nth degree with beautiful things and beautiful movements, the oryoki practice of eating with Japanese bowls. And the same thing is true. It's more fun to do any of those things than to look at yourself and do something about yourself. So people tend to gravitate to any of those things. And then when you export all of that to America, those are the attractive things. And people do oryoki practice, and I learned it too. It's very complicated, and it is beautiful. It's a very lovely way to eat a meal in meditation. But if you think about it, just learning to eat with knife and fork is also an art and a practice. And really the point is to eat. So in this country at the moment, there are a lot of things that pass for Zen or are called Zen. If you go to Trader Joe's, a couple of years ago you had Zen soap and you had Zen cereal. And it's all very well and it's good fun, but it also is a little bit not doing justice to the practice of seriously investigating how you can be the very best human being that you can be given your body and mind, which is bigger than all of those things. And once it becomes one of those things, it just becomes a thing of beauty, but it's somebody else's beauty. Like this calligraphy, for instance, that is here. It's beautiful. And you told me what it means, but I've already forgotten it, and I can't read it. So I look at it and I think, that was somebody else's expression, and I can only get part of it. I can see the beautiful shapes, but what is the meaning again?
It means something like, flowers are beautiful, the moon is also beautiful, but the mind that is aware is the most beautiful of all.
Which is a beautiful sentiment, and that person gave beautiful expression to it. And if any of us ordinary people want to understand it, we'll have to either learn calligraphy or find somebody who speaks our language. And I may be mistaken, but I think that's what the Buddha said already to his monks when they go to various parts of the country, that they should speak the local lingo, as opposed to some fancy, spiritual, deep, beautiful language that ordinary people couldn't understand. So there's those two things, and they don't stand against each other, but they do need to be recognized for what they are. Soto Zen, the kind of Zen that I'm taught and teach, is said to be farmer Zen or stupid people Zen. Because you don't actually need to even be able to read. It helps if you can read, and it helps if you can listen to people talk, but it's not really necessary. If you want to look into your own heart, you can do that as is. In the Soto Zen tradition, we also just sit. That's what we were saying this morning. But if you have a slightly smarter mind, or a mind that is a bit more active, you might go to Rinzai Zen, where they have the practice of intellectual, unsolvable problem solving. Has anybody heard of that? You have. And that is one of the aspects of Zen that has made its way into the American awareness of what Zen is. And this fellow named Paul Reps, he printed out a little booklet probably 50 years ago now, and I'm sorry to say, Paul, but he didn't do us a great service. Because what he did is he took little koan stories from the Rinzai tradition, and he presented them as a snapshot of life. And so the story goes as follows. Somebody's practicing Zen, and he's walking by a pond, and all of a sudden a frog jumps from the side of the pond into the pond, plop, and the person is enlightened. End of story. And there's another story. Somebody was struggling very deeply, and he's sitting by a little bamboo brush, and his teacher comes by and throws a rock into the brush and startles, and he has an enlightenment experience. End of story. And so now many Americans, they want this snap thing to happen out of nowhere. And I actually had a woman practicing with me for 11 years. And she kept wanting me to throw something against a piece of bamboo. And I kept refusing. And in the end, she stopped practicing because she was so frustrated. What the stories don't tell you is that there's 20 or so years of arduous practice of just doing the day-to-day meditation, bowing, chanting, washing the dishes, making lunch, eating lunch, having a nap, doing some more practice, fighting with your impulses to run away, struggling with your opinions, struggling with your complaining mind, trying to get along with people, all those things. And then, yes, one day you may have a breakthrough moment, and some people have a very noticeable moment where you can say, that changed things for me. You don't even have to do Zen practice to have such a moment. And then after that moment come the next 20 years of ordinary daily life, but now it's from a slightly different perspective. But that has to be taken into account, because most of human life is that. Taking care of our bodies, taking care of our environments, trying to get along, finding ways to be the best person that we can be given our circumstances. And so these little cute Zen stories, they don't paint quite the right picture. And I just want you to know that, because the really more true picture is much more beautiful and much more human and much more doable for any one of us. So we can do this at different levels. And just as in other Zen practices, there are householders and there are the monastics. All of us are people. All of us are subject to the impulses of greed and aversion and fear or delusion. We all have that in common. And all of us will at times speak or act or think from those confusions and make mistakes and do something that is unwise or that causes some kind of pain, often unintentionally, but nevertheless. You have to remember that. No matter how far along somebody is in their spiritual practice, they can still make mistakes. And the further along they are, the more painful the mistake will be. And that is also true. But if you remember that we're all human, then number one, you won't put anybody on a pedestal and expect them to be perfect. And number two, you can have some sympathy. And number three, you can maybe be less hurt because you can say, okay, there's a human being doing something. What can I do with that? How can I receive that, process it, not react on it, and make something from that that is for the good? And that is how the practice is done. Whatever happens to you can be a dharma door, can be an occasion to turn it round, to make it into something that is useful. Doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Doesn't mean it'll be immediately perfect. But it gives you a handle on things that is other than that of being a victim. And to me that is a very attractive handle, to not be a victim. So all of those are things that Zen sort of weaves in and out of, but is not. And it is up to you as an individual to decide really where you want to go, where you pick it up, how far you want to take it, what suits you, what is beneficial to you. And then that is good for you. And even if nobody else wants to do it that way, you still do it. That's something that I came across very early on in my practice, is that if I want to go and meditate and look at myself and do something about myself, that is completely up to me. It's not dependent on if anybody else agrees with me. It's not dependent on if anybody else is doing it also. And sometimes it helps if other people do it too, but it doesn't. They don't have to. It's completely up to me. And if I stick with it, that's good enough for me. Nobody has to stand around and applaud. I think that's really wonderful. This is what I want to do with my life. You do with your life. Some people do very big things with their life, and other people do very seemingly small things, but they all need to be done at some point or other. There was a time, this also was when I was in England, when I was not well, and I couldn't do very much physically. And I didn't like that at all, because I had always been very active and very useful, and I enjoyed doing things. And so to not do things, not get the job satisfaction, basically, was hard for me. And I really had to question my understanding of what it was that I was about in life. I was already a monk, and it turned out, after a while, if something gets taken away from you, you suddenly realize that you hadn't realized how much you had taken that for granted and how much that was part of your identity. And so here, all of a sudden, I had to ask myself, what kind of a monk am I if I'm not even doing any service? I'm just sitting here in my room. What kind of a monk is that? And it was a struggle that went on for some months, where I started questioning what it was that I thought it meant to be a monk. And when you're young and very energetic and can do all stuff, you can think, okay, that's to be of service. So my sort of shape was to give. And then I started to ask myself, what does that mean, really, to give? I was still also meditating, but I was also asking that question. What does it mean to give? There's all kinds of giving. And so I'm pondering this question. And then one day, I was so bored in my room, I thought I'd go sit in the meditation room for a while, just for a change of scene. Take one wall and go sit in front of another wall. And I'm the only one there because everybody else is working. And the windows were open, and you could hear people out in the garden, and you could smell some smells coming from the kitchen, and it was just a lovely day, and I felt totally sorry for myself and very sad that I was sitting there, boring myself to death just in the meditation room. And next to me on this side was a brick wall of all these little bricks. It's very British. And as I'm sitting there, all of a sudden, one of these tiny little bricks begins to glow a little bit. I'm kind of looking over to one side like that without moving my head. And this brick is glowing, very beautiful. And then I thought, that brick is so small you ordinarily don't even see it. But it is part of the wall. And if it wasn't there, there'd be a hole. And I'd be having a draft. So there's a purpose for that brick to just sit there and be nothing in particular. Not any different, not spectacular, not beautifully carved. It was just sitting there. And that was very inspirational to me. To be willing to just be a little brick in a big wall of a lot of other bricks without any special achievement. Then I went back to my room and I carried on pondering the meaning of giving. And as I was watering my plant, I suddenly thought giving can be giving up. And that was the one thing I had not wanted to do. All the while that I was sick, I was thinking, I'm a monk, I'm not giving up, I'm carrying on, I'm not giving up, I just have to find another way. And at that moment I thought, well, giving up is a form of giving, and that was such a blow that I had to sit down. I was standing up, I had to sit down. That was a shock to me. Because giving up was the last thing I ever wanted to do. I thought that was failure. But actually what it meant was I had to give up my opinion of what it was that my life was about. And that's a form of dying, actually. That's a life-threatening thought, because we invest in how we are, and if we're not that, we're dead, we cease to be. So I had to sit down for a while there, and I sat down for a while, and then having let that one go, there's all kind of potential. There's all kind of things you can do when you're not well. There are all kinds of ways in which you can create blessings for other beings. There's all kinds of ways in which you can benefit the world by just meditating. Be content, be friendly in your interactions, and purify all that internal crap that gets in the way of just being content. And that is a practice. Fortunately for me and many other people, since then I got well and I do things again, but I do them from a different perspective. And that makes a difference. So I'm sorry to talk so much about me, but it's an example. Now we'll do some more walking, and then we'll do some more sitting.